On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the German Sixth Army in the basement of a bombed-out department store in Stalingrad, and in doing so, Paulus became the highest-ranking German officer ever captured alive, the commander of the first full German field army destroyed since the Napoleonic Wars, and the man whose defeat drained more than 800,000 Axis casualties from the southern Eastern Front. That number needs to sit with you for a moment, because 800,000 is not a statistic the human mind processes easily. This is the story of how a city that was never supposed to be the primary objective of the 1942 German summer offensive became the graveyard of an entire army group, and why the 199-day siege of Stalingrad stands as the deadliest battle in recorded human history, with combined losses approaching 2 million soldiers and civilians between July 1942 and February 1943. Stalingrad did not begin as a battle over a city. Stalingrad began as a battle over oil, and the road to that department store basement started not in the rubble of the Volga riverbank but in a conference room, with a single directive that split an army group in half and sent two weakened forces chasing two objectives that were each too large for a full-strength force to achieve alone. By the spring of 1942, Germany's position on the Eastern Front had shifted at its foundations. Operation Barbarossa, the June 22, 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union involving approximately 3.8 million Axis personnel, had shattered the pre-war Red Army but failed to deliver the knockout blow. Moscow held, the Red Army survived, and the war Germany's leadership had designed as a 6-week lightning campaign ground into its second year without resolution. The German war machine ran on oil, and Germany was running dry. On June 1, 1942, the German leadership told senior officers the truth in plain terms: without the oil of Maykop and Grozny in the Caucasus, the war could not continue. That was not rhetoric. That was an operational assessment grounded in production numbers. Germany's synthetic fuel plants could not keep pace with consumption across 3 active fronts, and the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, Germany's single largest external supply, were already running flat out. Modern petroleum logistics companies manage supply chains measured in millions of barrels per day across global networks, and back in 1942 the German military faced that exact same problem, maintaining uninterrupted supply across enormous distances with hostile interference, except the German solution was not pipeline engineering or predictive analytics. The German solution was to physically conquer the source. Conquering the Caucasus oil fields meant first securing the Volga River corridor, and that corridor ran through a 50-kilometer industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga, a city called Stalingrad. Führer Directive No. 41, signed April 5, 1942, laid out the summer offensive known as Case Blue, or Fall Blau, and the directive was explicit about Stalingrad's role as a secondary objective, a flank protection measure. Directive 41 stated that every effort would be made to reach Stalingrad itself, or at least to bring the city under fire from heavy artillery so that Stalingrad would cease to function as an industrial or communications center. The Caucasus was the end, and Stalingrad was only the means. Case Blue launched on June 28, 1942, and the initial results looked spectacular as German forces advanced rapidly through the southern steppe, covering ground at Barbarossa-era speed. Rostov-on-Don fell on July 23, 1942, and that's when a decision was made that changed the trajectory of the entire war. Führer Directive No. 45, signed that same day, split Army Group South into 2 separate formations. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, would drive southeast toward the Caucasus oilfields in Operation Edelweiss, while Army Group B, under Field Marshal Maximilian von Wakes, would drive east toward Stalingrad and the Volga in Operation Fischreier. 2 Army groups now chased 2 objectives along diverging axes of advance, all dependent on shared logistics networks stretched across hundreds of kilometers of open steppe. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, the original commander of Army Group South, had already been relieved on July 15, 1942, just days before the split, partly because von Bock had resisted the very dispersion that Directive 45 now formalized. The standard narrative frames the Battle of Stalingrad as a defeat caused by the brutal Russian winter, and that framing is incomplete and on several counts misleading. Temperatures inside the Stalingrad pocket during the winter of 1942 to 1943 dropped to approximately -30 degrees Celsius, which was severe but not unprecedented on the Eastern Front and not the primary driver of the Sixth Army's destruction. The real cause was structural. Directive 45 divided German strength at the operational level, created flanks hundreds of kilometers long held by undermanned and under-equipped Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian formations, and chased two objectives simultaneously that each demanded the full commitment of an army group. What that means, stripped down, is that the battle was functionally lost before the first German soldiers set foot in the city. The spearhead of Army Group B's advance toward Stalingrad was the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, roughly 20 German divisions reinforced by elements of General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. Paulus was a meticulous staff officer rather than a battlefield improviser, a man who had helped plan Operation Barbarossa itself by working out the logistics tables and movement schedules at OKH headquarters and who now carried the burden of executing the operational reality of those same plans in the field. Buried in the Sixth Army's composition was a detail that would prove critical later. Among the German divisions served over 50,000 Hiwas, the Hilfswillige or voluntary auxiliaries, Soviet prisoners of war and civilians pressed into service as laborers, drivers, cooks, and even frontline combatants. Two divisions tell the story most clearly. In the 71st and 76th Infantry Divisions, Hiwas made up approximately 50% of ration strength by mid-November 1942. That meant the Sixth Army was not a purely German force, and roughly a quarter of its frontline strength consisted of men who had been fighting on the opposite side just months earlier. The flanks looked even worse. Romania's Third Army held the long exposed northern flank running along the Don River, Romania's Fourth Army covered the southern flank, and the Italian Eighth Army along with the Hungarian Second Army filled the remaining stretches. Across the southern eastern front, 52 Axis Allied divisions occupied positions that German forces could not spare the manpower to fill. These formations were undersupplied, undertrained for Eastern Front conditions, and dangerously short of anti-tank weapons, a vulnerability that Soviet intelligence had already identified and catalogued down to specific unit locations. Stalingrad itself was not a compact urban center but an industrial ribbon stretching approximately 30 to 50 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga while extending only a few kilometers inland at most points. Three massive factory complexes anchored the northern end: the Stalingrad Tractor Factory, converted to produce T-34 tanks, the Barakati Ordnance Works, which manufactured artillery pieces, and the Red October Steelworks. Together these three factories formed the industrial spine of the city. South of the factory district, the terrain transitioned into residential blocks and administrative buildings, with the strategic high ground of Mamayev Kurgan, designated Height 102.0 on military maps, offering observation and fire control over the central Volga crossing points. Controlling the Volga at Stalingrad would sever the Soviet Union's primary north-south transport artery, the corridor carrying Caucasus oil, southern grain, and Lend-Lease materials arriving through Iran. Beyond the raw logistics, the city bore the name of the Soviet leader, which turned Stalingrad into a symbol as much as a military objective, and both sides understood the political weight of that symbol from the outset. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating urban bombing campaigns of the entire war. Starting at approximately 3:18 in the afternoon, Luftflotte 4, commanded by Colonel General Wolfram von Richthofen, the same officer who had previously directed the bombings of Guernica and Warsaw, sent roughly 1,600 sorties over Stalingrad and dropped approximately 1,000 tons of bombs. Destruction of the central water supply on August 24 killed any hope of fighting the fires spreading through the city's wooden residential districts, and that was the end of Stalingrad as a functioning city. The civilian death toll from the August 23 bombing remains disputed, and the gap between competing figures is wide. Standard histories cite approximately 40,000 killed from a pre-war population swollen by refugees to between 700,000 and 900,000, but historian Richard Overy has pointed out that local civil defense authorities actually counted 3,931 civilian deaths from July through October 1942, a figure Overy argues fits better with the scale of bombing and tonnage dropped. What nobody contests is the physical result. Approximately 90% of the city's housing turned to rubble within the first week of aerial bombardment, and by the time German ground forces entered Stalingrad, the city had become a landscape of shattered concrete and exposed steel that would dictate the character of fighting for the next 3 months. Also on August 23, advance elements of the Sixth Army reached the Volga River north of the city. Paulus had arrived at Stalingrad, but the city had not been abandoned. On September 11, 1942, Lieutenant General Vasily Chukov took command of the 62nd Army, the Soviet formation defending Stalingrad's urban core. Chukov was 42 years old, blunt, physically imposing, and cut from entirely different cloth than the commanders who came before him. When asked at a meeting what Chukov understood the 62nd Army's task to be, Chukov's answer left no room for interpretation. The 62nd Army would hold the city or die there. Within days, Chukov identified the core tactical problem. German doctrine ran on combined arms warfare, coordinated use of air power, artillery, armor, and infantry in open terrain, and in the steppe approaches the doctrine had been devastating. Rubble collapsed those advantages entirely. Aircraft could not bomb positions sitting meters from friendly troops. Tanks could not maneuver through shattered streets choked with debris. Artillery could not engage targets hidden in basements and sewer tunnels. Chukov recognized all of this and built the 62nd Army's entire defensive strategy around one concept: hugging the enemy. What that meant in practice was holding Soviet positions within grenade-throwing distance of German lines, sometimes 30 meters, sometimes 15. At that range, German close air support aircraft risked hitting their own troops, and German artillery batteries faced the same problem. The enormous firepower advantage that had defined German operations across the steppe evaporated because of proximity alone. Chukov put the principle in his own terms: every German soldier must be made to feel that the German soldier was living under the muzzle of a Russian gun. Chukov reorganized the 62nd Army into autonomous shock groups, small self-contained units of approximately 50 to 100 soldiers carrying submachine guns, grenades, knives, and entrenching tools. These groups operated semi-independently, infiltrating German positions through sewer systems, breaching walls between buildings, clearing floor by floor and room by room. Germans labeled this style of combat Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, and German soldiers bitterly joked that the Wehrmacht could capture the kitchen of an apartment building and still be fighting for the living room. September 13, 1942 brought the first full-scale German assault on the city center, with forces attacking Mamayev-Kurgan, the central railway station, and the landing stages along the Volga where Soviet reinforcements crossed from the eastern bank. That railway station changed hands approximately 15 times over the following weeks. Fighting for Mamayev-Kurgan reached an intensity that defied normal military measurement, and when recovery teams surveyed the site afterward, they pulled between 500 and 1,250 metal splinters from every single square meter of soil. Snow on the slopes melted from constant explosions and fire, and the earth stayed black well into the following spring. On the night of September 14 to 15, 1942, Colonel Alexander Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division crossed the Volga under direct German shellfire in what became the most critical single reinforcement of the entire battle. Rodimtsev's guardsmen went straight from the river into combat at the railway station and on the slopes of Mamayev-Kurgan, and the cost was immediate. Within the first 24 hours, approximately 30% of the division fell dead or wounded. By the end of the first week, losses hit 80%. When the battle finally ended months later, roughly 320 of the original 10,000 men of Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division were still breathing. Among the most famous engagements inside the city was the defense of a four-story apartment building on January 9th Street, later designated Pavlov's house. On September 27, 1942, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led a four-man reconnaissance team that seized the building, and Pavlov commanded the initial defense for approximately 3 days before Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev arrived and took command for the duration, which stretched approximately 58 to 60 days until November 25, 1942. The garrison grew to roughly 24 to 31 soldiers drawn from multiple nationalities within the Red Army, and the defenders fortified the building with PTRS and PTRD anti-tank rifles positioned on the roof, weapons that picked off German armor approaching through the surrounding streets. A communications trench linked Pavlov's house to Gergart's mill for resupply and communication. 3 defenders died across the entire 58-day defense, and during those same weeks, a baby named Zinoida Andreeva was born in the basement. Chukov later remarked that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than the Germans lost taking Paris, and that line has echoed through every documentary since. But here's the thing: the dramatic framing of Pavlov's house as a lone fortress holding against overwhelming assault was partially constructed after the fact. German archives do not support heavy, sustained fighting for that specific building, and Soviet military archives attach no special operational importance to Pavlov's house as a unique defensive structure. The building functioned as one fortified position among many, integrated into the 13th Guards fire defense system across the sector. Yakov Pavlov and Ivan Afanasiev were real soldiers who fought a real defense, but the lone fortress story was Soviet propaganda, effective for morale, detached from the fuller picture. What Stalingrad actually pioneered has had a longer life than any propaganda narrative. Chukov's shock groups, 50 to 100 fighters operating semi-independently in the rubble, functioned on principles that modern militaries now formalize as mission command, decentralized decision-making where small unit leaders operate with tactical autonomy within the commander's overall intent. The U.S. Marine Corps' contemporary urban warfare doctrine explicitly draws on the lessons of the 62nd Army's small unit tactics, which meant Stalingrad operated not just as a battle but as a laboratory for how armies would fight in cities for the next 80 years. The sniper war within Stalingrad became one of the most celebrated and most embellished threads of the entire battle. Vasily Zaitsev, a soldier in the 1047th Rifle Regiment of the 284th Rifle Division, is credited with 225 confirmed kills at Stalingrad, with some sources placing the count at 242. Zaitsev developed team-based sniper tactics called the Sixes method, training other marksmen and deploying sniper cells across the 62nd Army sector. Zaitsev was real, documented, and lethally effective. The famous sniper duel between Zaitsev and a German marksman identified as Major Erwin Koenig, allegedly the head of a Berlin sniper school, forms the centerpiece of the film Enemy at the Gates. That duel is fiction. Antony Beevor, after going through Russian Ministry of Defense archives, concluded that the entire story was a clever invention of Soviet propaganda. British historian Frank Ellis, writing in the Stalingrad Cauldron published in 2013, found no German record of any Koenig and confirmed that Germany ran no Berlin sniper school in 1942 or 1943. Zaitsev's lethality was genuine, but the duel was manufactured. Less discussed but operationally serious was the role of women in the defense. Approximately 75,000 women and girls from the Stalingrad area received military or medical training and served during the battle, and women crewed many of the anti-aircraft batteries protecting the city. Elements of the German 16th Panzer Division discovered, to their shock, that the AA guns they had been fighting were operated entirely by female crews. Soviet sources record approximately 1,000 Soviet snipers across the war as women, with female snipers active within the Stalingrad sector. Sustained urban combat at that intensity left marks on the body as much as the mind. Friedrich Paulus developed an uncontrollable facial tic that worsened as the battle dragged forward. Vasily Chukov developed eczema so severe that Chukov had to bandage both hands for extended periods. Soldiers on both sides reported auditory hallucinations, mental breakdowns, and a lost ability to tell day from night in the smoke-filled ruins. German Private First Class Walter Oppermann captured the feeling in a November 1942 letter home. Stalingrad was hell on earth, Verdun with new weapons, where the 6th Army attacked daily, and if in the morning the Germans managed to push forward 20 meters, by evening the Russians threw them right back again. The Volga River crossings served as the lifeline of the entire defense and ranked among the most lethal assignments in the Red Army. Reinforcements, ammunition, and food crossed the Volga by barge and small boat under constant German artillery and air attack, and witnesses described barges loaded with soldiers going down mid-river. When ice floes choked the Volga in November, resupply stopped entirely for days and left the 62nd Army cut off on the western bank. A dying Soviet guardsman scratched a message into the wall of the contested railway station. Rodimtsev's guardsmen fought and died here for their motherland. Behind the front lines, Stalin's Order No. 227, issued July 28, 1942, imposed the doctrine of not a single step back. Order 227 formalized penal battalions, the Strafbat, and expanded the use of blocking detachments called Zagradotriety, run by the NKVD and stationed behind Soviet lines with orders to stop unauthorized retreats by any means. The actual scale of executions by blocking detachments is one of the most contested aspects of the battle, and the documented figures tell a more specific story than the popular image of mass shootings suggests. On the Stalingrad front between August 1 and October 15, 1942, blocking detachments detained 15,649 soldiers. Of those 15,649 detained men, 278 were shot, 244 were arrested, 218 went to penal companies, 42 went to penal battalions, and 14,833, the overwhelming majority, were sent back to their units. Across the entire Red Army from 1942 through 1945, a total of 422,700 personnel received penal battalion sentences. Those numbers are grim, but the widespread image of machine guns mowing down retreating soldiers by the thousands at Stalingrad does not hold up against the documented NKVD records. While the world's attention locked onto the block-by-block carnage inside Stalingrad, Soviet planners Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky assembled something far larger beyond the flanks. Throughout September and October 1942, as German forces bled themselves white against Zhukov's 62nd Army in the rubble, Zhukov and Vasilevsky quietly built a massive strike force north and south of the city. The plan carried the codename Operation Uranus. The concept behind Uranus was elegant in design and devastating in what it promised. The German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army had concentrated in and around Stalingrad, focused forward on the Volga, which left the flanks exposed. Hundreds of kilometers of open steppe stretching along the Don River to the north and the Kalmyk steppe to the south were held by Romania's 3rd Army on the northern shoulder and Romania's 4th Army on the southern shoulder, with the Italian 8th Army and Hungarian 2nd Army plugging additional gaps. Soviet intelligence had identified exactly what German staff officers feared most: the Allied formations on those flanks were under-equipped, under-trained for mechanized warfare, and dangerously short of anti-tank weapons, and the Romanian divisions held frontages far wider than German doctrine recommended. These formations were holding the door shut on a room that was about to be blown apart. The scale of the Soviet buildup was staggering. Approximately 1.1 million troops assembled for the offensive, supported by roughly 900 to 1,000 tanks, approximately 1,400 aircraft, and an estimated 14,000 artillery pieces and mortars. Moving this force into position across the steppe in winter conditions without detection demanded immense discipline. Soviet maskirovka, military deception, relied on false radio traffic, dummy positions, and strict movement protocols where columns traveled only at night and tanks hid in ravines and dry streambeds during daylight. Coordination stretched across 3 fronts: the Southwestern Front under General Nikolai Vatutin, the Don Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky, and the Stalingrad Front under General Andrei Yeryomenko. Nikita Khrushchev served as the political commissar on the Stalingrad Front, and Colonel General Nikolai Voronov coordinated the artillery. 3 fronts, over 1 million troops, and converging pincers spanning hundreds of kilometers made this the most complex operation Soviet military planning had attempted up to that point in the war. At 7:20 Moscow time on November 19, 1942, the northern pincer launched. Thousands of artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along Romania's 3rd Army front, and the bombardment shattered Romanian positions within hours. Soviet tank and mechanized corps punched through the gaps and drove south at maximum speed. 1 day later, on November 20, the southern pincer struck Romania's 4th Army from the Stalingrad front, and the southern flank collapsed even faster than the northern one. Both pincers, the northern force driving south and the southern force driving north, raced toward a pre-designated meeting point at Kalak on the Don, a small town on the Don River approximately 80 kilometers west of Stalingrad. If the pincers met at Kalak, the entire German 6th Army, elements of the 4th Panzer Army, and all associated formations would be trapped inside a ring of Soviet armor. On November 22 to 23, 1942, Soviet forces met at Kalak. The ring closed, and the Kessel, the cauldron, was sealed. The exact number of Axis personnel trapped inside the pocket remains debated. Conservative estimates place approximately 210,000 inside as of November 19. Broader counts including highways and rear area personnel range from 250,000 to 290,000, and the figure commonly cited in order of battle analyses reaches approximately 330,000 when all Axis personnel and auxiliary forces are included. What nobody debates is the scale. The Kessel measured roughly 50 kilometers by 40 kilometers, approximately 30 miles wide by 20 miles deep, and contained over 20 German divisions, supporting units, and thousands of vehicles, horses, and supply depots now severed from all ground resupply. German leadership faced an immediate decision. The first option was to order the 6th Army to break out westward while the encirclement was still thin. The second was to order the 6th Army to hold in place while the Luftwaffe resupplied by air and a relief force fought its way through from outside. General Major Arthur Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff, opposed a breakout. General Walther von Seydlitz-Gersbach, commanding the LI Corps, argued passionately for an immediate breakout and even authorized local withdrawals in the northern sector to shorten the line and free up forces, an action that infuriated the high command. Paulus assessed that the Sixth Army lacked the fuel and mobility for a sustained breakout through Soviet armored forces in open terrain, communicated that assessment upward, and waited for orders. The orders came: hold. The Sixth Army would remain in Stalingrad, form a hedgehog defense, and await aerial resupply. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, personally guaranteed the aerial resupply of Stalingrad, and that guarantee turned out to be one of the most consequential lies of the entire war. The decision to supply the Sixth Army by air rested on a single recent precedent, and that precedent was dangerously misleading. Earlier in 1942, approximately 100,000 German troops encircled at Demyansk had been sustained by an aerial supply operation delivering roughly 300 tons per day. Demyansk worked, and that success planted false confidence that air supply could sustain a much larger force over a longer period at greater distance. The Stalingrad airlift failure demonstrates what modern logistics professionals call the scalability fallacy, the assumption that a system functioning at one scale will function at a larger scale without fundamental redesign. Companies like FedEx and Amazon pour billions into predictive logistics infrastructure because they understand that tripling delivery volume does not mean tripling the number of trucks. Infrastructure, routing, and capacity have to be rebuilt from the ground up. The Luftwaffe tried to triple the Demyansk operation without the aircraft, the airfields, or the fuel to support it, and the outcome was catastrophic. The mathematics alone made it impossible. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the German General Staff, calculated that the Sixth Army required a minimum of 300 tons delivered per day to sustain combat operations, and that hitting 300 tons delivered meant lifting approximately 500 tons per flying day after accounting for weather cancellations, mechanical failures, and losses to Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Sixth Army's own initial demand ran even higher at 750 tons per day. When Zeitzler presented the 500-ton requirement, Göring declared the Luftwaffe could handle it. Zeitzler's response cut through the room. Zeitzler told the gathering that Göring's claim was a lie. What actually reached the pocket confirmed Zeitzler in devastating detail. According to Robert Forsyth's study To Save an Army, the Stalingrad airlift, the Luftwaffe delivered a total of 8,350 tons of supplies into the Stalingrad pocket between November 24, 1942 and February 3, 1943, which averages to approximately 116 tons per day, less than a quarter of the minimum daily requirement and less than a sixth of what the Sixth Army asked for. Of those 8,350 tons, approximately 600 consisted of fuel, 1,122 of ammunition, 2,020 of rations, and 129 of miscellaneous supplies. December 19, 1942 brought the best single-day delivery at approximately 242 tons, and even that peak fell short of the 300-ton minimum. The fleet pressed into service included Junkers Ju-52 trimeters, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's transport capacity, alongside Heinkel He-111 medium bombers converted for cargo runs, Junkers Ju-80s XS, and Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor long-range maritime patrol aircraft dragged into transport duty. Departure airfields were Tatsinskaya and Morozovskaya, and inside the pocket, receiving airfields were Potomnik and Gumrak. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft batteries strung along the flight corridors extracted a rising toll. By the end of the operation, the Luftwaffe had lost 488 transport aircraft, 274 destroyed or missing and 214 damaged beyond repair, along with approximately 1,000 aircrew killed. Those 488 aircraft represented a sizable chunk of Germany's total transport fleet, and the loss crippled Luftwaffe logistics operations far beyond Stalingrad for the remainder of the war. Inside the pocket, the supply shortfall compounded day after day. Surgical ether, antiseptics, and bandages ran out, which meant surgeries went forward without anesthesia. The horse-drawn supply trains attached to the German infantry divisions, a critical transport element most popular histories overlook, devoured enormous quantities of fodder. When the fodder ran out, the horses were slaughtered for meat, and when the horse meat was gone, starvation moved through the pocket unchecked. Some of the air deliveries crossed into dark absurdity. German soldiers desperate for food, ammunition, and medical supplies cracked open airdrops to find spices, contraceptives, and metals. These manifestly useless deliveries came from a chaotic rear-area logistics chain where supply depots packed whatever sat on the shelves rather than what the pocket needed, a failure of prioritization piled on top of the failure of tonnage. By January 1943, the average German soldier in the pocket was consuming approximately 200 calories per day, well below the 1,500 calorie threshold for basic metabolic function and catastrophically short of the 3,500 to 4,000 calories required for physical labor in sub-zero conditions. Frostbite cases multiplied across every unit. Men wrapped rags around their boots. The weakest soldiers simply sat down in the snow and never stood up again. Field Marshal Erhard Milch arrived in January to salvage the airlift, but none of that mattered because the window had already closed. Potomnik Airfield fell to Soviet forces on January 14, Gumrak fell around January 21 to 23, and without functioning airfields inside the pocket, the airlift collapsed entirely into scattered parachute drops that deposited supplies across open ground, much of it landing in no man's land or territory the Soviets already controlled. While the airlift failed in slow motion, the German High Command assembled a relief force. On November 24, 1942, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein took command of the newly formed Army Group Dawn with one mission: break through the Soviet encirclement and re-establish contact with the Sixth Army. Manstein's relief operation, codenamed Operation Winterstorm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter, launched on December 12, 1942 from the town of Kotelnikovo, approximately 150 kilometers southwest of the pocket. The striking force was the LVII Panzer Corps under General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the 6th Panzer Division. The initial advance covered ground fast, breaking through successive Soviet defensive lines as Hoth's armor drove northeast toward the Stalingrad pocket. By December 19, 1942, the relief force reached the Mishkova River, approximately 48 kilometers from the outer edge of the Kessel. 48 kilometers, roughly the distance from central London to Heathrow Airport, and this was the moment that decided everything. The operational record here tells a different story than the winter killed them version. Manstein's relief force sat within striking distance. A breakout by the 6th Army, codenamed Operation Thunderclap, Donnerschlag, had been planned and could theoretically have been timed to match the relief force's push inward. Combined pressure, an outward push from the pocket and an inward push from Hoth, might have cracked the ring open. Paulus did not launch Thunderclap. The 6th Army stayed put. Paulus cited fuel because the 6th Army's vehicles carried approximately 30 kilometers worth, not enough for a 48-kilometer fighting breakout across open terrain against Soviet armor. Paulus also cited orders: no authorization to abandon Stalingrad had come down. The breakout order never arrived. Manstein later wrote in Lost Victories that the breakout would have forced the 6th Army to fight as if forming a square, but that the hope of freedom and deliverance from captivity would have given the troops the strength to pull off the impossible. Whether that was real military judgment or post-war reputation management is still debated, and historian Gerhard Weinberg wrote that Manstein worked as hard to distort the record on this question as Manstein had on other matters during the war. And then the window slammed shut. On December 16, 1942, 4 days after Winter Storm launched, the Soviets opened Operation Little Saturn, a massive offensive that crushed the Italian 8th Army northwest of Stalingrad and threatened the entire rear of Army Group Dawn. Manstein now faced a second crisis: if Soviet forces from Little Saturn reached Rostov-on-Don, Army Group A in the Caucasus, hundreds of thousands of additional German troops would be cut off entirely. On December 23, 1942, Manstein halted Winterstorm. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army pulled back, Kotelnikovo fell to the Red Army on December 29, and the last chance to save the 6th Army disappeared. Those who defend Paulus's decision to hold point to a strategic justification beyond obedience: the 6th Army, by staying in place, tied down 7 Soviet armies that would otherwise have been free to chase Army Group A. Army Group A did successfully extract from the Caucasus in early 1943, aided partly by the Soviet forces committed to grinding down the Stalingrad pocket. Whether the 6th Army could have broken out and still maintained that pinning effect is the central unanswerable question of the battle. On January 8, 1943, General Rokossovsky, commanding the Don Front, sent Paulus a formal surrender offer with guarantees of food, medical treatment, and return of personal belongings. Paulus turned down the offer, again pointing to orders. 2 days later, on January 10, 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, Operacja Koltso, the final reduction of the Stalingrad pocket. 7 Soviet armies struck the perimeter simultaneously, backed by concentrated artillery barrages among the heaviest of the war. The pocket, already gutted by months of attrition, starvation, and cold, collapsed inward rapidly. Potomac Airfield fell on January 14, funneling all remaining supplies and evacuations through Gumrak, a smaller and more congested field already within range of Soviet artillery. Gumrak fell around January 21 to 23, and the airlift died with it. Whatever flights continued amounted to individual aircraft dropping parachute bundles, most of which drifted beyond German lines. The pocket compressed from roughly 50 by 40 kilometers to a fraction of that area and split into two separate pockets, a southern pocket centered on the city center and a northern pocket anchored on the barricade and tractor factory complexes. The Sixth Army ceased to function as a military formation and fragmented into clusters of soldiers huddled in basements, cellars, and ruins, many too weakened by starvation to fight or even move. On January 24, 1943, Paulus radioed a final appeal to the German High Command: 18,000 wounded without any supplies or dressings or drugs, further defense senseless, collapse inevitable, requesting immediate permission to surrender in order to save the lives of remaining troops. The answer came back: permission denied. January 30, 1943 fell on the 10th anniversary of the German government's assumption of power, and on that date Friedrich Paulus received a promotion to Field Marshal. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Virtually everyone, including Paulus, recognized the promotion for what it was, an implied instruction to take his own life rather than face capture. Paulus told an adjutant that Paulus recognized the implication but had no intention of doing the leadership any such favor. A blunter version of the statement also circulated: Paulus had no intention of shooting himself for a Bohemian corporal. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered in the basement of the Univermag department store in the center of Stalingrad. Approximately 22 to 24 German generals entered Soviet captivity alongside Paulus that day. General Karl Strecker's northern pocket, built around the 11 Corps, held out 2 more days. On February 2, 1943, Strecker's forces surrendered, and the Battle of Stalingrad ended. The reaction at the German leadership's headquarters was fury. Resentment poured out that Paulus had not killed himself after receiving the highest military rank, and the declaration followed that this would be the last field marshal appointment of the war. A second remark expressed disbelief that a man who watched 50,000 or 60,000 of his soldiers die bravely could then hand himself over to the enemy. Approximately 91,000 Axis soldiers surrendered at Stalingrad, with some sources placing the number as high as 100,000. And this is where it gets worse, because what followed makes the battle itself look merciful. Tens of thousands died on the forced march south to the Beketovka prisoner of war camp. Typhus and starvation killed thousands more in the first months of captivity. According to Britannica, only approximately 5,000 to 6,000 of the captured soldiers ever returned to their homelands, and the last survivors did not come home until a full decade after the war ended in 1945. Of roughly 91,000 captured, approximately 85,000 to 86,000 perished in Soviet captivity, a survival rate of approximately 6 to 7%. Paulus himself survived. Friedrich Paulus joined the Soviet-sponsored National Committee for a Free Germany, a propaganda organization of captured German officers calling for an end to the war, and Paulus testified at the Nuremberg trials. After the war, Paulus settled in Dresden, East Germany, where Paulus lived until 1957 without ever returning to West Germany. The suffering of the Sixth Army in the Kessel and in captivity dominates the popular narrative of Stalingrad, especially in German cultural memory through films, memoirs, and national commemorations. That narrative is incomplete without confronting what the Sixth Army did before Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was directly complicit in war crimes on the Eastern Front. The Sixth Army provided logistical support to Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, including at Babi Yar, where approximately 34,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in September 1941, and at the Bilat Tserkva massacre of approximately 800 people. A surgeon attached to the Sixth Army tested expanding bullets on prisoners of war. These are documented facts established through post-war investigations and confirmed by historians including Omer Bartov. The post-war narrative portraying the Wehrmacht as a clean fighting force while atrocities fell exclusively on other organizations, the so-called clean Wehrmacht myth, has been demolished by decades of scholarship. Manstein himself was convicted of war crimes in 1949. The Sixth Army was not a blameless formation undone by bad luck and bad weather, but an instrument of a war of annihilation that participated in that annihilation before the annihilation turned back on it. The full casualty accounting of Stalingrad shifts depending on what is counted and which source is consulted. Soviet losses for the entire Don-Volga campaign, covering the defensive phase from July 17 to November 18, 1942, and the offensive phase from November 19, 1942 to February 2, 1943, reached 1,129,619 according to the official Russian archival study by Grigory Krivoshev, published as Soviet Casualties and Combat Losses in the 20th Century. Of that total, 478,741 were irrecoverable losses, meaning killed, missing, or captured, and 650,878 were wounded or sick. Antony Beevor, in Stalingrad, The Fateful Siege, put the figure at 1.1 million casualties with 485,751 fatalities. David Glantz's Stalingrad trilogy, published between 2009 and 2014, works from the same archival base and stresses that the Kotlebin operations north of the city alone cost over 200,000 Soviet casualties. Operations, Glantz argues, decided Germany's fate before German troops ever entered the city itself. Soviet equipment losses included 2,769 aircraft, 4,341 tanks, and 15,728 guns and mortars. Axis losses are most authoritatively placed at more than 800,000 dead, wounded, missing, or captured across all nationalities. The common breakdown attributes approximately 400,000 to German forces, approximately 200,000 to Romanian forces, approximately 130,000 to Italian forces, and approximately 120,000 to Hungarian forces. The Soviet wartime claim of 1,500,000 Axis losses, cited by historian Jeffrey Jukes in 1968, is regarded by modern historians as a gross overestimate. Combined casualties across all sides approach 1.8 to 2 million soldiers. Adding civilian deaths, which fall somewhere between the contested figures of approximately 4,000 and approximately 40,000, pushes Stalingrad's total human cost to a scale that confirms the battle as the deadliest single engagement in the recorded history of warfare. Stalingrad's meaning reached far beyond the numbers. The battle marked the first destruction of an entire German field army, and that destruction shattered the aura of German invincibility that had held since September 1939. After Stalingrad, Germany never regained the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. One more major Eastern offensive came at Kursk in July 1943, and it failed within weeks. From February 1943 until May 1945, the Wehrmacht fought a continuous retreat from the Volga to Berlin. Stalingrad did not happen in a vacuum. The British victory at El Alamein in October to November 1942 and the Allied landings in North Africa through Operation Torch, launched November 8, 1942, ran simultaneously with the Stalingrad campaign. The Axis powers were fighting a global war across multiple fronts, and by early 1943, they were losing on every one. Among those concurrent reverses, Stalingrad stood as the largest in scale, the most damaging in consequences, and the most psychologically devastating to both the German military and the German civilian population. One question that historians continue to examine is the role of Lend-Lease, the American and British program of material aid to the Soviet Union, in the Soviet victory at Stalingrad specifically. At the time of the battle, only approximately 5% of Soviet military vehicles came through the Lend-Lease pipeline, which means Lend-Lease did not decide the outcome at Stalingrad. The 62nd Army did not hold the riverbank with American trucks, and Operation Uranus was not fueled by British aviation gasoline. Lend-Lease grew strategically important from 1943 onward, particularly the Studebaker trucks that gave the Red Army mobility for deep operations like Operation Bagration in 1944. Both Zhukov and Khrushchev privately credited Lend-Lease with enabling later Soviet maneuver and reducing Soviet casualties. The historical consensus, assessed by institutions including the National World War II Museum, holds that the Soviet Union likely wins the war regardless, but Lend-Lease shortened the war and saved lives. Stalingrad no longer exists on any map. Under Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign in 1961, the city was renamed Volgograd. Founded as Tsaritsyn in 1589, renamed Stalingrad in 1925, the city has carried the name Volgograd for over 6 decades. Today Volgograd is a regional capital of approximately 1 million people, an industrial and agricultural center served by the Volga-Don Canal. The Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex, built between 1959 and 1967, dominates the Volgograd skyline. At its summit stands the Motherland Calls, Rodina Matzoviet, designed by sculptor Yevgeny Vuchetik and structural engineer Nikolai Nikitin, reaching 85 meters to the tip of the raised sword and standing as the tallest statue in the world at its 1967 completion. Vasily Chukov rests at Mamayev Kurgan, the only marshal of the Soviet Union buried outside Moscow, alongside 34,505 interred defenders. Vasily Zaitsev was reburied there in 2006. The statue underwent a major restoration costing approximately 750 million rubles and reopened on June 24, 2020. Pavlov's house was among the first buildings reconstructed in 1943 and carries a memorial wall today. Gergarts Mill, also known as Grudinin Mill, stands preserved in its ruined state beside the State Historical and Memorial Preserve dedicated to the Battle of Stalingrad. Battlefield finds including bone fragments, shell casings, and metal shrapnel still surface on Mamayev Kurgan. The debate over renaming Volgograd back to Stalingrad resurfaces periodically in Russian public life. For the 80th anniversary in 2023, the Volgograd City Duma approved temporarily reverting the city's name to Stalingrad on approximately 10 specified commemorative days per year, including February 2 and September 3. A 2023 survey by the state pollster VTSAOM, sampling 600 residents, found 67% opposed to a permanent renaming and only 26% in favor. In April 2025, Volgograd International Airport received the historical designation Stalingrad, a calibrated symbolic gesture that stopped short of renaming the city itself. On February 2, 2023, the 80th anniversary of the surrender, a ceremony at Mamayev Kurgan unveiled busts of Zhukov and Vasilevsky near the Battle Museum, alongside a bust of the Soviet leader whose name the city carried through its darkest chapter. The event confirmed what the battle itself established 8 decades earlier: Stalingrad is not a place that disappears from memory because someone changed a name on a map. 2 million soldiers fought for a ruined city on the Volga. Approximately 2 million of those soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or destroyed. The Sixth Army ceased to exist. Germany's offensive capability in the east broke and never recovered. And the apartment building where Yakov Pavlov positioned anti-tank rifles, the hill where Rodimtsev's guardsmen bled into the soil, and the department store basement where Friedrich Paulus handed over a field marshal's baton held for less than 24 hours all still stand in Volgograd, quiet now, along the banks of the Volga that the 62nd Army never let the Wehrmacht cross. The battle that was supposed to be a flank protection operation for the real objective, the Caucasus Oil, became the deadliest engagement in human history. And it started with a single directive that split an army group in two and sent both halves chasing objectives that neither half was strong enough to reach alone. That is how an army dies, not all at once, but one decision at a time.